Alright, let's go. Number 10. The silent rot that unmade Scotland's warrior kings. In the summer of 1214, King William the Sure of Scotland, the man history called William the Lion, died not on a battlefield, but in the grip of a bloody flux, spreading through his court at Stirling Castle. He had spent decades fighting to defend Scottish sovereignty against English domination, surviving wars, capture, and political humiliation. A contaminated water supply finished what England's armies could not. The disease that killed him had no name, no cure, and no mercy, and it left a kingdom dangerously exposed at precisely the moment it could least afford weakness. Dysentery, caused by bacteria, including Shigella and Campylobacter, transmitted through contaminated water and food, was among the most relentless killers in the medieval world. It worked quietly, invisibly, through the wells and rivers that entire communities depended on for survival. Medieval physicians had no understanding of bacterial transmission. They attributed the bloody flux to corrupted air, divine punishment, or imbalances of bodily humor, which meant that every intervention they attempted, purging, bleeding, herbal fumigation, accelerated the patient's deterioration rather than slowing it. William's death destabilized the kingdom already stretched thin. His successor, the young Alexander II, inherited a throne surrounded by English pressure and internal factional tension. The Chronicle of John of Fordun, the Chronica Gentis Scotorum, records the repeated devastation of Scottish royal courts and garrisons by epidemic illness throughout this period. Estimates drawn from comparative medieval military records suggest that dysentery killed between 20 and 40% of soldiers in affected campaigns, a figure that commanders of the era had no framework to anticipate or prevent. The political consequences extended for generations. Military campaigns repeatedly collapsed not from enemy action but from the catastrophic loss of men to waterborne illness in the field. The repeated weakening of Scotland's military capacity contributed directly to the conditions that made the wars of Scottish independence, fought between 1296 and 1328, so devastating and so prolonged. A kingdom that could not keep its fighting men alive long enough to march was a kingdom permanently on the edge of collapse. Dysentery killed more medieval soldiers and kings than any blade, yet it left no monuments and no memorials. It appears in historical records only as absences, armies that dissolved, campaigns that ended without battle, rulers who died without explanation. If Scotland's warrior kings had not been bled dry by contaminated water rather than English steel, the history of an entire nation might have looked entirely different. Number 9. The fever that rotted the lagoon's golden age. In the summer of 1361, the records of the Venetian Republic documented the deaths of nearly a third of the city's administrative council within a single season, not from warfare or conspiracy, but from the quartan fevers rising from the surrounding lagoon. Doge Giovanni Dolfin, who had guided the city through the initial catastrophe of the Black Death barely a decade earlier, watched his government dissolve around him as the disease consumed the men who made Venice function. The most sophisticated mercantile empire in the medieval world was being quietly dismantled by standing water. Venice's geography was simultaneously its greatest asset and its most insidious threat. The lagoon that protected the city from invasion also provided the perfect breeding conditions for Plasmodium vivax and Plasmodium falciparum, the parasites responsible for malaria, spread through the bite of Anopheles. Mosquitoes thriving in the warm, shallow waters surrounding the city. The malaria, meaning literally bad air in the medical Latin of the era, had been understood by Venetian physicians as a pestilential emanation from the wetlands for generations. Understanding it, however, offered no protection against it. The Venetian State Archive documents consular deaths across the 1361 epidemic with a clinical thoroughness that makes the scale of destruction visible even now. The city's pre-plague population had stood at approximately 120,000. The Black Death of 1347 to 1349 had already reduced it catastrophically. Malaria did not strike in a single devastating wave like plague. It worked differently, returning every summer, grinding down the population year after year, killing some and leaving others weakened, feverish, and cognitively impaired by repeated infection. It was a harrowing, relentless attrition with no visible end. The Venetian response to repeated epidemic devastation produced one of the most consequential public health innovations in history. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, a close Venetian ally in the Adriatic, formally instituted a 30-day isolation period for arriving ships and travelers. Venice followed, formalizing its own quarantine system by 1403, extending the isolation to 40 days, a period that gave the world the word quarantine, from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40. The city that would eventually master epidemic control learned everything it knew from surviving its own lagoon. The golden domes of Venice still rise above the waters that were quietly killing its rulers for centuries. The city invented quarantine because it had no other choice. Because the same geography that made Venice wealthy made it pestilential, and because the fevers of the lagoon proved more persistent than any enemy fleet. That Venetian innovation in epidemic management eventually became the foundation of all modern public health. Protocol is the most unexpected legacy a mosquito has ever left on human history. Number 8. The Blue Death that drowned the kingdom of the Danube. In 1347, as trade routes stretching from the Mongol steppe funneled goods and infection through the Hungarian plain, a wave of violent waterborne illness, unlike anything in living memory, struck the Danube basin. Victims turned the distinctive gray-blue of severe dehydration, collapsed within hours of the first symptoms, and were dead before the following dawn. Hungarian chroniclers, overwhelmed by the speed and grotesque character of the dying, recorded it as divine punishment for the kingdom's accumulated sins. No punishment, however, is this systematic or this merciless without a mechanism. The illness Hungarian communities were suffering was what medieval physicians called cholera morbus, a waterborne catastrophe caused by the contamination of drinking water with infected human waste. The Danube, the great artery of Central European civilization, served simultaneously as the primary water supply and the primary waste channel for every major Hungarian settlement along its banks. This was not negligence, but geography. The river was simply too vast, too central, and too essential to avoid. Every time someone drew water from it downstream of a settlement, they were drinking what the settlement above them had discarded. King Louis III of Hungary, known to history as Louis the Great, reigned from 1342 to 1382 and is remembered as one of the most capable rulers of his era. His military campaigns and diplomatic achievements are documented extensively in the Chronicon Pictum, commissioned in 1358. What the Chronicon cannot fully capture is the cost of repeatedly launching armies that waterborne illness was continuously decimating. The royal seat at Esztergom, the ecclesiastical and administrative heart of the kingdom, sat directly on the Danube, making it as vulnerable as the most desperate riverside village. Hungary entered the 14th century already catastrophically weakened. The Mongol invasion of 1241 to 1242 had inflicted population losses historians estimate at 30 to 50% across the affected regions, one of the worst demographic catastrophes in European history. The kingdom had spent a century attempting to recover those numbers when successive waves of waterborne disease began erasing the demographic gains that had been made. Populations that had taken 3 generations to rebuild were reduced again within a single epidemic season, creating a cycle of recovery and devastation that exhausted the kingdom's institutional capacity. Hungary never returned to the demographic strength it had possessed before the Mongol invasion, and waterborne disease was as responsible for that failure as the invasion itself. The Danube gave Hungary its heartland, its trade routes, and its agricultural wealth. It also gave Hungary a permanent, feverish vulnerability that no king, no chronicle, and no prayer could resolve. How different the balance of power in Central Europe might have been if the river that made the kingdom had not also been the kingdom's most relentless executioner. Number 7. The shaking fever that silenced the Republic of the North. In 1417, the Novgorodskaya Pervaya Letopis, the Novgorod First Chronicle, recorded an epidemic so catastrophic that it threatened the functioning of the city's Vetch, the democratic citizen assembly that had governed the republic for centuries. The chronicle's language is restrained in the manner of medieval record keepers, but the meaning is unmistakable. People were falling in the streets, the dead could not be buried quickly enough, and the civic institutions that made Novgorod unique in the medieval world were beginning to dissolve. The disease consuming the city was what we now retrospectively identify as epidemic typhus. Novgorod was, at the height of its power, the most remarkable political experiment in the medieval world. Governing a territory stretching from the Baltic coast to the Ural Mountains, with a population historians estimate between 400,000 and 600,000 people, it operated as a merchant republic with elected officials, citizen assemblies, and a legal system sophisticated enough to rival anything in Western Europe. The Rickettsia prowazeki bacterium that causes epidemic typhus, spread by body lice thriving in the cold, crowded conditions of northern urban housing, cared nothing for constitutional arrangements or civic achievements. Typhus works through the nervous system with harrowing efficiency. The infected suffer high fever, severe headache, a characteristic spotted rash, and, in fatal cases, catastrophic organ failure. In communities without understanding of louse transmission, the disease spread invisibly and irreversibly through the dense timber housing that Novgorod citizens depended on for warmth. The epidemic of 1417 arrived after a series of famine years between 1406 and 1409 that had already severely depleted the population's immune resilience. A starved population in crowded conditions was almost perfectly designed to maximize typhus transmission. Archbishop Simeon of Novgorod, who served from approximately 1415 to 1421, organized relief efforts and mass burial rites that are partially preserved in ecclesiastical records. His response, while compassionate, could do nothing to address the louse-borne transmission mechanism that was driving the epidemic forward. Every communal gathering, every church service, every civic assembly convened to address the crisis became another opportunity for the disease to spread. The Vetch itself, Novgorod's great democratic institution, may have accelerated the epidemic by bringing infected citizens into close proximity. The Vetch bells that had summoned Novgorod citizens to democracy for 3 centuries eventually rang for a city too feverish and too few to answer. The Republic's epidemic weakened political and military capacity contributed to the conditions that made its annexation by Ivan III of Moscow in 1478 possible. The most democratic political entity in the medieval world was not conquered by a superior army. It was consumed slowly and invisibly by the lice in its citizens' clothing. Number 6. The sweat that struck down the emperor's court in hours. In the summer of 1529, a disease of terrifying speed and grotesque character swept through the cities of the Holy Roman Empire. A man healthy at dawn could be drenched in foul-smelling sweat by midday and dead before evening prayers. The Schweissfieber, the sweating sickness, had already devastated England 5 times since its first appearance in 1485. Now it reached Augsburg, Marburg, and Strasbourg, killing scholars, physicians, priests, and imperial administrators with complete indifference to rank, education, or wealth. The heart of European civilization was suddenly, catastrophically, and inexplicably vulnerable. The sweating sickness had followed English armies onto the continent before, but the 1529 outbreak represented its most devastating European penetration. Physician Johann Agricola of Augsburg produced the first systematic clinical description of the disease that year, documenting its signature progression: a sudden onset of apprehension and shivering, followed by intense sweating, severe headache, delirium, and, in fatal cases, cardiac collapse within hours. Agricola recorded mortality rates that, in the worst affected communities, reached 30 to 50% of those infected. There was no prodromal period long enough to allow isolation, no treatment that reliably slowed the progression, and no explanation for why it struck some individuals and not others. The political consequences radiated outward immediately. Philip Melanchthon, the Protestant reformer whose correspondence from this period is among the most detailed contemporary records of the epidemic, documented how the sweating sickness disrupted preparations for the Diet of Augsburg, the critical imperial assembly that would shape the future of the Reformation. Men essential to the negotiations were dead or incapacitated. The epidemic did not merely kill individuals, it interrupted the ideological struggle that was remaking European Christianity, inserting pestilence into one of the most consequential political moments of the 16th century. The sweating sickness had appeared in 5 distinct waves: 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, and finally 1551. Then it vanished, completely, permanently. No subsequent outbreak was ever recorded anywhere in the world. Modern researchers have proposed hantavirus as the most plausible causal agent, given the speed of cardiac involvement and the absence of secondary spread through conventional contact, but no scientific consensus has emerged. The disease that could kill a healthy man in hours left no identifiable pathogen, no animal reservoir, and no lineage of subsequent outbreaks to trace. A disease that killed half its victims within a day, struck 5 times across a century, disrupted an empire, interrupted a reformation, and then disappeared without a single recorded subsequent case, remains one of the most apocalyptic and inexplicable episodes in medical history. It killed fast enough that its victims had no time to write wills, receive last rites, or say farewell. Then it was simply gone, as completely and as mysteriously as if it had never existed, leaving only the dead and the unanswerable question of what it actually was. Number 5. The pox that emptied Castile's throne and crossed an ocean. In the spring of 1520, a man named Francisco Eguía, infected with variola major, and sailing with Pánfilo de Narváez's expedition, landed at Veracruz on the coast of Mexico and began what historians would later identify as the greatest biological catastrophe in recorded history. But the disease that would erase the Aztec Empire had already spent decades reshaping Castile itself, killing members of the royal family, destabilizing the succession, and demonstrating that smallpox observed no boundaries of rank, distance, or political consequence. By 1520, Castile and its colonies were already intimately acquainted with devastation. Smallpox caused by variola major killed between 20 and 60% of immunologically naive populations and left survivors permanently scarred, frequently blinded, and sometimes cognitively impaired. In Castile, the disease moved through the social hierarchy with particular brutality during the late 15th century. Prince Juan, the only male heir of Ferdinand and Isabella, and the future the entire Castilian succession depended upon, died in 1497 following a period of illness that contemporary court physicians documented with growing alarm. His death collapsed the planned succession and initiated a dynastic crisis that ultimately placed the mentally fragile Joanna de Ferns, later called Joanna the Mad, on the Castilian throne. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar whose Historia de las Indias remains one of the essential primary sources for early colonial history, documented the smallpox epidemic of 1518 to 1519 across the Caribbean with a horrifying precision. On the island of Hispaniola, the indigenous Taíno population, which had already been devastated by forced labor and violence, was reduced by an estimated 90% within a single epidemic cycle. Las Casas wrote of villages emptied so completely that there was no one left to bury the dead. These were not abstractions. These were the documented consequences of a pathogen that Castile had carried across the Atlantic inside the bodies of its own people. The Castilian crown understood, at some level, what was happening. Francisco de Bobadilla's 1500 administrative report to the crown had already documented epidemic devastation in the colonial territories with sufficient detail that the scale of indigenous mortality could not be ignorantly dismissed. What no one in Castile fully grasped was that the smallpox reshaping their royal succession and the smallpox erasing entire civilizations across the ocean were the same disease, operating according to the same virulent logic, simply encountering populations with different levels of prior exposure. Castile's smallpox did not merely kill its princes, it crossed an ocean inside a single infected man and erased empires that had stood for 1,000 years, making it the only pathogen in recorded history to simultaneously reshape dynastic succession in Europe while annihilating entire civilizations on another continent. The disease that destabilized Castile's throne and the disease that destroyed the Aztec Empire were identical, moved by the same invisible mechanism carrying consequences that neither a king in Valladolid nor an emperor in Tenochtitlan had any capacity to foresee or survive. Number 4. The holy fire that made an entire kingdom go mad. In 994 AD, the chronicler Adhemar of Chabannes and the monastery records at Saint Gilles in Aquitaine documented something that read like a passage from Revelation. Across the southern regions of Francia, thousands of people were screaming that their limbs were on fire. Their skin was blackening and falling from their bodies while they still lived. Some convulsed uncontrollably, seeing visions, speaking in tongues, and tearing at their own putrefying flesh. Physicians had no name for it. The church called it Ignis Sacer, the holy fire. 40,000 people died in southern Francia alone before the outbreak subsided. The cause was a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, growing invisibly in the wet rye harvests that fed the Frankish peasant population. Ergot alkaloids produced by the fungus caused two distinct syndromes depending on which compounds were most concentrated in the contaminated grain. The gangrenous form produced catastrophic vasoconstriction. Blood flow to the extremities ceased, limbs turned black, and the affected tissue simply died and separated from the living body, often with a burning sensation so intense that victims described it as being consumed from within by invisible flames. The convulsive form produced hallucinations, seizures, and psychotic episodes that medieval observers could not distinguish from demonic possession. King Robert II of France, who reigned from 996 to 1031, presided over a kingdom that experienced ergotism epidemics in 994, 1039, 1089, and 1129, each outbreak correlating directly with wet harvest years that favored fungal growth in stored rye. The political consequences of mass psychosis and mass physical incapacitation were immediate and devastating. A peasantry that was simultaneously hallucinating, gangrenous, and dying could not plant, harvest, or pay taxes. A kingdom whose agricultural workforce was being decimated by corrupting grain was a kingdom being dismantled from its economic foundations upward. The Order of St. Anthony, founded in 1095 at the monastery of La Motte Saint-Didier specifically to care for ergotism victims, named the disease St. Anthony's Fire and became the primary institutional response to an epidemic that medieval medicine had no other framework to address. The monks provided care and, crucially, a different diet free of contaminated rye, which is why many pilgrims who traveled to St. Anthony's shrines experienced what appeared to be miraculous recoveries. The miracle was simply nutrition from uncontaminated grain. The historian Linda Caporel, writing in the journal Science in 1976, linked ergotism outbreaks to episodes of collective hysteria across medieval and early modern Europe. If a fungus growing invisibly in contaminated grain could make thousands of people simultaneously mad, gangrenous, and suicidal across an entire kingdom, the question that follows is genuinely disturbing. How many of the dancing plagues, mass convulsions, and episodes of collective religious frenzy recorded throughout medieval history were not supernatural events, not social contagions, not expressions of collective psychological stress, but simply bad harvests with a grotesque name that no chronicler thought to record? Number 3. The living death that consumed the Byzantine Empire from within. In 1090 AD, Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos issued an imperial edict expanding the leprosarium network at Constantinople, not from compassion alone, but from desperation. Anna Komnene, the emperor's daughter, documented in her extraordinary biographical chronicle, the Alexiad, that the leprosoi had become so numerous in the capital that their presence was destabilizing commerce, military recruitment, and the social order of an empire, already under severe external pressure. Leprosy, caused by Mycobacterium leprae, had been consuming Byzantium for centuries. By the 11th century, it was winning. Mycobacterium leprae does not kill with the apocalyptic speed of plague or the feverish violence of typhus. It operates on a timescale measured in years and decades, destroying peripheral nerves, disfiguring the face and extremities, and leaving its victims in a state of progressive, irreversible incapacitation. In Byzantine law, a diagnosis of leprosy constituted a form of civil death. The infected were stripped of their property, separated from their families, excluded from worship, and declared legally non-existent while they continued to breathe. Byzantium was generating a population of the living dead that its institutions had no mechanism to reintegrate or recover. Paleopathological analysis of Byzantine skeletal remains from burial sites at Edirne, and Corinth has confirmed the presence of Urd M. leprae DNA in 12th century graves, providing physical evidence that corroborates the chronicle accounts of widespread infection. The Byzantine hospital system, the nosocomaia and leprokomaion, were among the most sophisticated medical institutions in the medieval world, drawing on Greek, Roman, and Arabic medical traditions. They were, by the 11th and 12th centuries, overwhelmed. The infrastructure of care had been built for a manageable endemic disease. It was operating in the conditions of a slow-motion catastrophe. The military consequences were direct and irreversible. Byzantine frontier defense depended on a professional army that could not include men diagnosed with leprosy because Byzantine law required their discharge. As the disease spread through the provincial populations from which soldiers were recruited, the pool of available fighting men contracted. This contraction accelerated at precisely the moment the Seljuk Turkish advance was placing maximum pressure on Byzantine Anatolia. The empire was losing territory to external enemies while simultaneously losing the manpower to defend what remained. Driven partly by a disease that was rendering its own citizens legally invisible, Byzantium did not fall in a single siege. It was hollowed out over centuries by a disease that turned its own people into ghosts while they were still alive, stripping them of legal identity, separating them from their communities, and draining the military and demographic reserves the empire needed to survive. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 found a city and an empire already diminished by centuries of wretched attrition. The walls came down not because the empire's enemies were uniquely powerful, but because the empire itself had been quietly, irreversibly, and mercilessly emptied from within. Number 2. The siege that launched the Black Death into the world. In 1346, the Mongol army of Janibeg Khan, besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, began dying faster than it could fight. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would become the history's most devastating killer, was tearing through the Golden Horde's encampment with a speed and lethality that no military commander had ever encountered. Janibeg could not advance, could not retreat without abandoning his strategic position, and could not stop the dying. What he did next was not an act of desperation. It was a decision that would kill 25 million people. He ordered his soldiers to catapult the plague-ridden corpses of his own dead over the walls of Kaffa. Gabriele de' Musi, a Genoese notary writing in approximately 1348, documented the siege and its biological consequences in his Historia de Morbo, the primary surviving account of the Kaffa event. De' Musi recorded that the catapulted corpses poisoned the water and air inside the city, that the Genoese threw the bodies into the sea as quickly as they could, and that it was not quickly enough. Yersinia pestis, confirmed as the Black Death's causal agent through ancient DNA analysis published by Stephanie Hensch and colleagues in PLOS Pathogens in 2010, had already penetrated the city's defenses through rat and flea vectors before the first corpse cleared the walls. The catapulting accelerated what geography had already made inevitable. Janibeg Khan, who had ruled the Golden Horde since 1342, died of plague himself in 1357. The succession crisis that followed his death contributed directly to the political fragmentation that eventually destroyed the Horde. The disease he had attempted to weaponize consumed his own empire with the same annihilating efficiency it was simultaneously applying to Europe. Yersinia pestis demonstrated no loyalty to its carriers. The Mongol military that had made the Golden Horde the dominant power in the Eurasian steppe was reduced to a fraction of its former capacity within a single generation, weakened by the same bacterium it had tried to use as a weapon. The Genoese merchants who fled Caffa by ship carried Y. pestis to Messina in Sicily in October 1347, the documented entry point of the Black Death into Western Europe. Within 5 years, the bacterium had reached every major city from Lisbon to Moscow, killing between 30 and 60% of Europe's total population. The specific arithmetic of the catastrophe is almost impossible to absorb. Approximately 25 million people dead, entire villages erased, the agricultural, ecclesiastical, and administrative structures of medieval civilization cracking under the weight of simultaneous, irreversible, continental loss. The Siege of Caffa represents the specific documented moment when the worst epidemic in human history crossed from the Mongol steppe into the trading networks that connected the medieval world. Every church with a plague saint, every mass grave excavated from a 14th century European city, every royal dynasty disrupted, and every social order transformed by the Black Death traces its origin to a military commander, a besieged port, and a decision to turn his own dead into weapons. The Black Death was not simply a natural catastrophe that befell Europe. It was launched from a catapult by a desperate general who had no idea what he was unleashing. Number 1. The plague that unmade medieval England and rewrote history itself. In June 1348, a merchant ship docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset, and within days the surrounding villages had begun to empty. Geoffrey Le Baker's Chronicon, one of the most detailed contemporary English accounts of the epidemic, describes communities collapsing so rapidly that the survivors had no time to comprehend what was happening before they too were infected. By Christmas, the plague had reached London. By 1350, between a third and a half of England's entire population was dead. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million people, from a total population estimated at 4 to 6 million, simply ceased to exist within approximately 2 years. Yersinia pestis moved through 3 distinct clinical forms in England, and each was catastrophic in its own register. The bubonic form, transmitted by rat fleas, produced the characteristic swellings at the lymph nodes, the blackened buboes that gave the disease its eventual popular name. The pneumonic form, transmitted directly between humans through respiratory droplets, killed within 2 days of symptom onset. The septicemic form, entering the bloodstream directly, killed so fast that victims died without any external signs, healthy in appearance 1 hour and dead the next. Medieval English physicians, working from Galenic humoral theory that had no framework for bacterial infection, were entirely powerless against all 3. The mortality did not discriminate by rank. King Edward III's daughter Joan died of plague in Bordeaux in September 1348 on her way to her wedding in Castile. Edward's letter to King Alfonso X of Castile documenting her death survives in the historical record, a father's grief rendered formal in diplomatic language. Archbishop of Canterbury John de Stratford died in the epidemic, as did his successor John de Ufford, who never took office before the disease claimed him. The Anonymal Chronicle and Ralph Higdon's Polychronicon. Both document the devastation across institutional, ecclesiastical, and civic life with a comprehensiveness that makes the scale of collapse unmistakable. The physical evidence is equally unambiguous. Excavations at East Smithfield in London, conducted by the Museum of London Archaeology between 1986 and 1988, uncovered mass burial pits containing hundreds of plague victims in ordered rows, a detail that reveals how rapidly the crisis overwhelmed normal burial capacity while suggesting that some institutional organization persisted even at the epidemic's worst point. Ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains from East Smithfield has confirmed Y. pestis as the pathogen. These are not chronicle accounts that might be exaggerated or misunderstood. These are the actual bones of the actual dead, and the bacterium that killed them is still identifiable in their remains. The social transformation that followed was irreversible. The catastrophic labor shortage created by the deaths of between a third and a half of England's population gave the surviving peasantry a leverage over their landlords that no political movement had ever achieved. The Statute of Labourers of 1351, Parliament's attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, was defied with a persistence that the law could not contain. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the direct political consequence of a population that had survived the unsurvivable and understood, viscerally, that the old order's authority rested on a demographic foundation that no longer existed. Every village green in England that sits beside a church with no surrounding houses, every field that went unfarmed after 1350, every surname that ends in a medieval trade no family ever carried on again, these are the fingerprints of a plague that did not merely kill the medieval world, it erased it and replaced it with something new. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.